So the steps involved when a microbe causes disease in a host. So this is kind of an overview of the whole process, starting with the step 1, which is where you can find the right portal of entry, and 2, where you have attaching firmly to the and negotiating the microbiome, and then 3, surviving host defenses. So these things are how they become established. So becoming established. And they have to do that first. Then they can cause damage, and then they can exit the host. So those are the 5 steps that we're going to talk about. And I broke this up and used it as kind of a point to show you where we are in the process. So you'll see the slide several times, but that's the overall thing. And just to note, I usually have you describe these 3 steps of becoming established. So 1, 2, and 3 here in green. And then I have some questions about what are some of the causes of the damage. And then I have some questions about what the portals of entry and the portals of exit are. So generally you'll note that the portal of entry, where it comes in, is also usually the same. So if it comes in through the skin, it probably goes out through the skin. If it comes in through food or water through the GI tract, then it probably goes out through the GI tract, etc. So we'll talk about those in the next few slides here. So the first thing is that they find a portal of entry, and it is also the correct infectious dose. You have to have a high enough infectious dose for this to really be able to do anything, but for sure it has to come in through the correct portal of entry. And one thing I would note is that there are some bacteria and some organisms or entities, like even a virus could be included in this, that have multiple portals of entry. They can come in through multiple ways. And sometimes the way that they come in is the type of disease they're going to cause. Like if they come in through the respiratory tract, they're going to cause a respiratory disease, but not always. And these portals of entry, the skin, GI tract, respiratory tract, urogenital tract, endogenous biota, this is where they come in. This is a portal of entry is, if you'll note, this is also places where we see a lot of resident microbiota. So normal microbiota exist on the skin, the GI tract, the upper respiratory tract, the urogenital tract, and so those are portals of entry as well as locations where we find normal microbiota. And so endogenous biota can sometimes, that's not a portal of entry in per se, it's just like that some bacteria are already present and they find a way to go to a different area. So portal of entry, and all you really have to do is explain that, give some examples on this, but it's a route that the microbe uses to initiate infection. So it usually gets in through the skin or the mucous membranes. So you're breathing it in, or you ingest it, or it gets in through the skin. So exogenous, it's coming from outside of the body. Endogenous, it's coming from outside of the body, or sorry, inside the body. It's already existing in the body. So normal microbiota or a previously silent infection would be an endogenous source. So some of the skin locations, they can come in through a nick or abrasion, a puncture, some very, very tiny places. Sometimes they're very inapparent. You don't know how they got in, but they somehow got in. So intact skin is a very tough barrier because there's several layers of dead skin on top, and viruses in particular need living cells to get in. Bacteria, they can just kind of make their way through the skin if they have the correct enzymes and things. But in any case, if you have broken skin, if you have a cut or a scrape or a puncture, that is going to allow them in. Gastrointestinal tract as a portal, that's they get the food, they get this in food, water, drinks, other ingested substances. Respiratory tract, that's where you breathe it in, and there's mucous membranes all lining the upper respiratory tract, and so a lot of times the microbes are transferred from one site to another if you breathe in really too early, deeply. Sometimes if you have, so there's eustachian tubes, and so they can transfer to other places, the sinuses, and they can go into the ear through some of those other locations. So the extent to which an agent is carried into the respiratory tract is based on its size and like how deeply you inhale, and so that can make a difference. Urogenital, this is where we talk about the sexually transmitted infections. And so STIs are what used to be called STDs, but they're really not always causing disease, but sometimes they're asymptomatic, and so they call them sexually transmitted infections now, because it is not always going to cause symptoms. And while they're infecting you, they may not be causing disease. So pathogens are transmitted by sexual means, and they account for about 4% of the infections worldwide, a lot of those being HIV. 13 million new cases in the United States every year, and they can enter through various points of the skin or the mucosa, including the penis, external genitalia, the vagina, cervix, and urethra. So during pregnancy and birth, pathogens can get through the placenta, and those are what we call the Storch diseases. We'll list those here in a minute. But it's basically the placenta is this tissue around is the womb, essentially, and it is in the uterus. So it's formed by maternal and fetal tissues, and there is a blood barrier, so it's separating the blood from the fetus and the blood from the mother. They don't cross paths unless there's a breakage of some sort, like what happens during childbirth. So it permits a lot of diffusion of nutrients and gases to the fetus, and few of the microbes can cross the placenta because they're small enough, and they are spread by the umbilical vein into the fetal tissues. So if the mother has it and is during pregnancy, that can be passed to the child. So other infections are transmitted perianally, so at childbirth, perinatally, as the child is passing through the birth canal. So that is during childbirth. So you can see here the blood of the fetus and the blood of the mother is separated. There's lots of blood vessels going to these various tissues and around and surrounding the amniotic, the placenta. So the Storch diseases are common infections of the fetus and the neonate. That's the portal of entry is through the placenta. That is kind of the point of this one. So syphilis, toxoplasmosis, other diseases like Coxsackie virus, varicella zoster, which is chickenpox, AIDS, and chlamydia are listed under the other. I think I would also list listeria, rubella, which is German measles, cytomegalovirus, which causes mono, that's a form of mono, herpes virus, and it's usually the herpes simplex 2, but it could be herpes simplex 1, so herpes simplex viruses. And so the most serious complications will cause spontaneous abortion and congenital abnormalities like with toxoplasmosis, brain damage, prematurity, and stillbirth. So there's a lot of things that can happen as a result of these infections, and the baby's just really in a very fragile state, still developing, and so there's a lot of things that can happen if the microbes cross the placenta and get into the baby. So the size of the inoculum is also part of this. In a previous edition of the book, they considered it portal of entry and infectious dose, like the size of the infectious dose. So the percentage of the minimum number that's required for an infection to proceed, well, minimum number of microorganisms required for an infection to proceed is called the infectious dose. And so it's smaller for some, bigger for others, and it's determined experimentally, but the microbes with smaller infectious dose are greater virulence because they require only a few microorganisms or fewer microorganisms, so they have a greater virulence. And so if you have a particular like optimal size of infectious dose and come in through the portal of entry, then you're more likely to establish infection. So that is basically step 1.